announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
Imagine the tension building in the dead of night. A massive U.S. aircraft carrier, the Gerald R. Ford, cutting through the open sea, carrying with it an unmatched display of military might. But lurking just beneath the surface, a silent, shadowy presence is following its every move. The sound of a faint echo reverberates across the sonar screens. A Russian submarine, expertly maneuvering, is closing in on the carrier. No alarms, no rush, just the eerie calm of a quiet, tense standoff. What's going on beneath the waves? And what happens when one of the world's most powerful military forces is tested in real time by a formidable adversary? This is not just another day at sea. This is a deliberate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, testing nerves, strategy, and military readiness. But this confrontation is more than just a simple naval encounter. It's a test of power, control, and psychological warfare. Today, we dive into one of the most intense modern naval confrontations, the shadowy game between the U.S. Navy's might and a Russian submarine. It was a quiet, calculated encounter that shook the waters, with both sides reading the other's every move. What's the true story behind the cold, calculated moves of these two world powers? Stick around as we uncover the details of this high-stakes naval confrontation that stayed just below the surface, literally and figuratively. In the quiet, unforgiving depths of the open sea, tension was building to a boiling point. At 2:17 a.m., aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, a routine surveillance mission had suddenly turned into something far more dangerous. The massive aircraft carrier, one of the most powerful symbols of American military might, was cruising through a volatile part of the world's oceans. But something was wrong. The radar operators, working under the dim glow of their consoles, saw an anomaly. A faint echo appeared on their sonar screens. Something was lurking just beneath the waves. At first, the crew brushed it off as nothing more than background noise. After all, the seas were often full of natural disturbances, and they had encountered plenty of other ships and submarines over the years. But this time, the echo seemed different. There was an unsettling consistency to it, a smooth, deliberate pattern in its movements. As the minutes ticked by, the crew became increasingly aware of the situation. They weren't alone. The Gerald R. Ford was being followed by a Russian submarine. The decision to follow such a powerful and high-profile target like the USS Gerald R. Ford wasn't made lightly. A strategic move like this required meticulous planning, a deep understanding of the area, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. The Russian submarine had been tracking the carrier for days, ever since it had entered international waters near the Venezuelan coast. Tensions were running high due to the ongoing sanctions against Venezuela, and Russia had a vested interest in keeping a close watch on the U.S. Navy's presence in the region. This was not just a routine patrol, it was a message. The Russian submarine was sending a clear signal. Russia was not intimidated by American dominance on the seas. It was a deliberate challenge, a test of the U.S. Navy's readiness to respond to a potential threat, and a message to Washington that Russia was still a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't an isolated act of aggression, but a part of a broader strategy of power projection meant to disrupt the U.S. presence in international waters. As the days wore on, the submarine continued to shadow the Gerald R. Ford from a safe but increasingly closer distance. Its crew knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't trying to attack. They were testing the carrier's defenses, gauging the response time, and analyzing the behavior of the U.S. Navy's warships in the vicinity. They were watching, learning, preparing for whatever the future might bring. On board the Gerald R. Ford, the situation was growing more tense by the hour, but outwardly, the crew maintained a calm and professional demeanor. The air was thick with a sense of quiet urgency. The information center aboard the carrier was fully engaged, processing every movement, every sonar ping, and every slight shift in the submarine's depth. No alarms went off. There was no sense of panic. The Gerald R. Ford wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of American resolve, and its crew was trained to handle threats without flinching. But this was not just a cat-and-mouse game. The USS Gerald R. Ford had been in hostile waters before. but the presence of a Russian submarine made this situation even more fraught with potential consequences. For years, the U.S. Navy had prided itself on maintaining absolute control of the seas, particularly in areas where global tensions were highest. But now, here was Russia, challenging that control with a single, silent vessel. The aircraft carrier's crew was well aware of the psychological pressure mounting on them. The question wasn't whether or not the submarine would attack, it was whether the crew could remain composed and continue their mission without overreacting. Would they let this act of provocation dictate their actions? Or would they respond with measured control and dominance, showing the world that they could handle any challenge, no matter how subtle or dangerous? It was a test of resolve, but importantly, it was also a test of strategy. The Russian submarine knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't trying to force a confrontation. Instead, it was checking the resolve of the U.S. Navy. Would they alter course in response to the threat? Or would they maintain their position and continue their mission as planned? Every decision was carefully calculated, from the depth at which the submarine operated to the precise speed it kept. It was a display of military acumen, a calculated psychological maneuver designed to probe weaknesses and test the waters, literally and figuratively. And as the hours passed, the operators aboard the Gerald R. Ford continued to monitor the situation, carefully analyzing every bit of data, knowing that the world's most advanced military was being tested by a silent, shadowy adversary deep beneath the waves. The Russian submarine's movements were deliberate, almost too precise to be dismissed as mere coincidence. From the very beginning, the crew aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford suspected that this wasn't just a chance encounter. The submarine's actions were calculated, designed not only to test the carrier's defense systems, but also to probe the U.S. Navy's strategic response. The crew of the Gerald R. Ford had faced countless challenges in their careers, but this was different. This time, the submarine wasn't trying to remain undetected. Instead, it was performing a high-stakes psychological maneuver, one that involved pushing the boundaries of American naval control without crossing the line into full confrontation. As the submarine tracked the carrier, it maintained a steady distance, occasionally veering closer, then retreating, as if gauging the reaction from the U.S. Navy. It wasn't just the submarine's movements that caught the attention of the crew. It was the pattern in those movements. It was almost as if the submarine was testing how long the U.S. Navy would wait before taking action. The tension was palpable, with the sound of each sonar ping growing louder and more insistent, but never quite crossing the line into hostile action. The Russian submarine knew exactly how to play this game. Its operators were skilled, well-trained, and experienced in the art of underwater stealth. The crew wasn't attempting to hide. It was making itself known, slowly pushing the limits of how far they could get without triggering an escalation. The purpose of the submarine's approach was not to attack, but to provoke. It was a challenge, a test of the Gerald R. Ford's ability to respond to subtle threats. The submarine wasn't just moving closer for reconnaissance, it was forcing the U.S. Navy to make decisions, to react to an unseen threat that could easily slip away without a trace. But for the Gerald R. Ford and its escorts, every movement of that submarine was critical. The crew knew they couldn't afford to overreact, but they also couldn't ignore the looming presence of an enemy vessel that could strike without warning. The situation was one of high stakes. How much pressure could the crew withstand before they felt compelled to take action? How long could they hold their course without making a potentially catastrophic mistake? It was a delicate dance, one where every decision carried weight. The submarine's crew was undoubtedly aware that their actions would be scrutinized, and every move had to be calculated. The goal was to test the American Navy's reaction time, its readiness, and its ability to handle an unpredictable situation. The submarine's movements grew bolder as the hours passed, closing in on the carrier with increasing confidence. It was as if the submarine wanted to make sure it wasn't overlooked. There was no attempt to remain undetected, quite the opposite. The crew was keenly aware of the psychological implications of their actions. This wasn't about gathering intelligence or achieving a tactical advantage in the traditional sense. It was about signaling power, showing that Russia was not intimidated by U.S. naval superiority. The Russian submarine wasn't merely tracking the carrier. It was sending a clear message. We are here, we see you, and we are capable of pushing boundaries. The U.S. Navy, however, refused to take the bait. There were no immediate moves to alter course or take aggressive action. The Gerald R. Ford maintained its steady course, its crew remaining calm and focused under the pressure. The aircraft carrier's response was a masterclass in restraint, a demonstration of the Navy's confidence in its ability to handle such provocations without escalating into conflict. The decision not to react immediately was critical in preventing the situation from spiraling out of control. Instead of succumbing to the psychological pressure of the submarine's proximity, the crew aboard the Gerald R. Ford held their ground, continuing to monitor the situation with heightened vigilance but without overt moves. But the silence between the two vessels wasn't without consequence. The submarine, with its steady approach, was sending a message to the Gerald R. Ford and to the rest of the world. It was a challenge of dominance, a reminder that while the U.S. Navy controlled the seas, there were forces willing to test that control. The submarine's calculated positioning was designed to make a point. Russia was still a formidable naval power, one willing to push its limits in a high-stakes game of military posturing. And with each passing hour, as the carrier sailed on undeterred, the tension between the two vessels only grew more intense. Would the U.S. Navy hold its ground? Or would this delicate game finally cross into something more dangerous? For now, the submarine remained a ghostly presence, just out of reach, testing the resolve of the most powerful navy in the world. As the Russian submarine inched closer, the crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford remained poised and alert, but they could not afford to ignore the potential danger that was closing in on them from below the waves. While the submarine had not yet made any aggressive moves, the carrier's crew knew that it was being tested. The fact that the submarine was not only shadowing the aircraft carrier, but actively maneuvering closer, altering depths and speeds, signaled a deliberate challenge, a test of U.S. Navy protocols and decision-making under pressure. The command center aboard the carrier was working at full capacity, analyzing each and every movement of the Russian vessel, running simulations to predict its next move and coordinating the actions of the carrier's escorts. The submariners' mission was clear: provoke a response. Their presence was not hidden. They knew the U.S. Navy was aware of them, and that was precisely the point. The Russian crew wanted to test how far they could push before the Americans reacted. The tension grew inside the command center as sonar operators pored over the continuous flow of data, watching the subtle shifts in the submarine's behavior. At first, there was the expectation of a reaction from the carrier. Perhaps the Gerald R. Ford would alter its course, or perhaps it would speed up, trying to shake off the submarine. Yet what became increasingly evident was the crew's unwavering calm. No alarms sounded, no sudden tactical changes were made. The aircraft carrier remained on its predetermined course, an unwavering symbol of U.S. naval power. Outside, the carrier's escorts, 2 destroyers, were on high alert, but they too maintained their positions. The destroyers adjusted their distance just slightly, repositioning themselves to ensure that they covered a wider area of the sea, bringing their advanced sonar and radar systems to bear. Yet there was no immediate attempt to engage the submarine. Instead, the escorts carefully analyzed the signals they were receiving from their own hydrophones, adjusting the ranges of their sensors and recalibrating their systems to ensure that they wouldn't miss a single movement from the Russian vessel. The decision not to immediately engage was a calculated move. By keeping their cool and avoiding any rash moves, the U.S. Navy demonstrated its ability to handle provocations without escalating the situation. The Russians, meanwhile, seemed to have anticipated this. They understood that the Gerald R. Ford and its escorts would not be easily rattled. But that was precisely why they kept pushing. Slowly, carefully, the Russian submarine increased its proximity to the carrier, maintaining its deep, almost silent path through the water. Their goal was not to engage directly, but to stay close enough to demonstrate their presence. Every time the American ships adjusted their positions, the Russians mirrored those actions, keeping just enough distance to avoid a direct confrontation, but enough proximity to provoke the question: how long could the Gerald R. Ford maintain its course without retaliation? Could the U.S. Navy continue to hold its ground, or would the pressure force them into a premature decision? The psychological warfare was becoming the most important part of this encounter. By now, the tension had seeped out of the control room and into every part of the ship. The USS Gerald R. Ford was not just a symbol of military might. It was a floating fortress, a symbol of American dominance. But it was also a place where human beings had to make decisions under extreme pressure. And in this moment, the crew's calm, deliberate response to the Russian submarine's actions was both a testament to their training and a crucial part of the larger game at hand. For every calculation they made, every sonar ping that came back, every shift in the depth of the submarine, they were learning something about their adversary. They were gathering intelligence, not through traditional means of warfare, but through sheer observation and restraint. Every moment of calm in the face of pressure was a victory in itself. Meanwhile, the Russian submarine's crew was playing their own game. Their mission was more complex than merely tailing the Gerald R. Ford. They were testing the Navy's readiness, seeing how far they could push the Americans without triggering a full-blown confrontation. They were well aware of the limits of their technology and the vulnerabilities of the U.S. Navy's systems. They knew the Gerald R. Ford would not be shaken easily, but their hope was that their presence would still provoke some sort of response. Their sub's stealth capabilities were being tested too, and while the Americans were aware of their presence, the Russians were trying to see how much they could get away with before their location was fully pinpointed. At some point in the night, the Russians seemed to make a move that could have escalated the situation. They powered up their active sonar, sending a clear signal to the Americans that they were no longer trying to hide. The decision was a clear challenge. In the murky waters of military engagement, where subtlety and hidden threats often take center stage, an active sonar pulse was a loud and unmistakable statement of presence. It was the first move that hinted at a potential confrontation, one that could have sparked an aggressive response from the U.S. Navy. But instead of panicking, the crew of the Gerald R. Ford responded with a calculated coolness. The Navy's commanders had prepared for such an eventuality. While the sonar pulse from the Russian submarine could have been seen as an invitation to escalate, the Gerald R. Ford did not flinch. It maintained its steady course, its escorts recalibrating their positions to track the submarine more precisely, but no alarms were raised. In the ensuing moments, the American ships intensified their efforts to track the Russian submarine's exact location. The destroyers launched multiple underwater acoustic sensors, hydrophones, and sonar buoys, creating a sophisticated web of detection around the submarine. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the Americans were playing with more technology, more resources, and more patience. They understood that the primary objective was not to engage directly, but to control the situation through strategic surveillance. The sonar buoys, now deployed in a ring around the area, provided a real-time map of the underwater environment, tracking the movements of the Russian submarine and sending constant updates to the command center aboard the Gerald R. Ford. The deeper the Russian submarine tried to go, the more difficult it became for it to hide. The American crew had all the tools they needed to track its every move. The moment of reckoning seemed to be fast approaching. The psychological pressure of the encounter had been building. The Russian submarine had demonstrated its ability to shadow the Gerald R. Ford without detection for several days. But now, it seemed the game was shifting. The Americans, in their silence and calculated response, were forcing the Russians into a corner. With each passing hour, the Russian submarine's options narrowed. The longer it stayed in the area, the more it risked detection, and the more pressure mounted on its crew. The tension was palpable, not just for the American crew who had shown incredible restraint, but also for the Russian submarine, which was now clearly outmatched in terms of technology and surveillance capabilities. The time for subtlety was running out. What would happen next? The U.S. Navy's response would determine the outcome of this high-stakes encounter. But it was clear that, for now, the balance of power lay firmly in their hands. As the hours passed, the standoff between the Russian submarine and the USS Gerald R. Ford became a silent battle of nerves and willpower. Neither side had yet made a move that could be considered overtly hostile, but the intensity was building. The crew aboard the Gerald R. Ford was well aware that this was not just a routine patrol. The submarine's persistence in shadowing them, combined with its increasingly bold moves, indicated that this was a test, one that could have significant political and military ramifications if escalated. But the U.S. Navy's response was clear. They would not be provoked. The Gerald R. Ford continued its course without altering its path or speed, a signal to the Russian submarine that the U.S. Navy would not bend to pressure. The calm, unwavering posture of the carrier was a deliberate demonstration of confidence and control. In this high-stakes game of military posturing, the Gerald R. Ford was sending a clear message to the world, and to the Russian forces, that no provocation would be enough to force a change in their operations. The crew of the carrier knew that by staying the course, they were signaling to Moscow that the U.S. Navy was capable of maintaining composure and operational integrity even under the most stressful conditions. But while the situation was tense, it had not yet reached a critical point. The psychological pressure was undoubtedly high on both sides. The Russians had been tracking the carrier for days, carefully analyzing the responses, or lack thereof, from the U.S. Navy. They had tested the American resolve, and now the time had come to gauge their final move. The turning point came when the Russian submarine, aware that its position had been compromised and that it had been fully identified by the U.S. Navy, began a slow, controlled retreat. The decision to back off was not made in haste. It was a carefully calculated withdrawal, made with the knowledge that staying too long in such a highly monitored area could lead to unnecessary risk. The submarine gradually increased the distance between itself and the Gerald R. Ford, its movements becoming more deliberate as it retreated into the depths of the ocean. Despite the perceived victory of the American Navy in forcing the submarine to withdraw, the reality was that both sides had gained something valuable. The U.S. Navy had maintained control of the situation, reinforcing its presence in international waters and showcasing its operational readiness. For Russia, the operation was not without its gains as well. The submarine's movements had been a calculated test of U.S. responses, gathering critical information on the capabilities of the Gerald R. Ford and the naval escort ships. While there had been no shots fired, the operation had still been a significant intelligence-gathering exercise. Both the Russians and the Americans had learned a great deal about the other's readiness, strategies, and surveillance techniques. The U.S. Navy had demonstrated its ability to track and control the submarine without resorting to escalation. The Russian submarine, on the other hand, had gathered valuable information about the American fleet's sensors, sonar systems, and its overall response to maritime threats. Despite the apparent lack of direct confrontation, both sides had achieved their goals without crossing the line into open warfare. This encounter, which could have easily spiraled into a full-blown crisis, ultimately served as a reminder of the complex nature of modern naval warfare. Today's military engagements often rely more on intelligence gathering, psychological tactics, and the ability to control the flow of information than on overt acts of aggression. The confrontation between the Gerald R. Ford and the Russian submarine was a demonstration of the increasing importance of restraint, surveillance, and strategic positioning in the modern military landscape. As the Russian submarine disappeared into the depths, the crew of the Gerald R. Ford knew that the encounter had ended, but the underlying political tension remained. This was not just a naval encounter. It was a reminder that the balance of power on the seas was constantly shifting, with every move being scrutinized by global powers. The standoff had ended without bloodshed, but the lessons learned on both sides would have lasting implications for future maritime operations. The world had witnessed a delicate dance between two nuclear-powered nations, one that had been played out beneath the waves, far from the public eye but no less important for it. Both sides, though wary of each other, had walked away knowing that the stakes were higher than ever before.